On Zombie Reddit, today's story is:
My parents took my sister away from me because I was a bad influence and my grandparents helped me to rehabilitate. 10 years later they want to come back. During my youth, I didn't make the best decisions and ended up surrounding myself with people who were not good for me. I was an inexperienced kid who acted without thinking, letting myself be carried away by impulses. I started using vaporizers and drinking alcohol, behaviors that I am ashamed of now. There is no way to justify my actions back then, but to be honest, I was drowning in a sea of depression and anxiety. Everything seemed too much to handle and, mistakenly, I thought I could escape my pain by distracting myself with these substances. The main reason for my suffering was losing Jenny, my best friend, when I was just 15 years old. Jenny and I shared such a special connection that people often thought we were siblings. We had grown up together and were practically inseparable. We had plans for everything. We wanted to go to the same university, live together, and we had even dreamed of having several dogs and a perfect house that we imagined together. It may sound like a childish dream, but for us it was very real. Jenny was my confidant. When something worried or bothered me, she always knew exactly what to say to make me feel better. So when she and her parents died in a terrible accident while traveling, my world fell apart. Due to the circumstances of the accident, it was impossible to identify their bodies. Their relatives had to organize a funeral without them, which made it even more difficult to process the loss. Losing Jenny was like having a part of myself ripped away. At just 15 years old, I had no idea how to move on. The sadness was so intense that it felt like physical pain. Although I had other friends, none of them compared to the connection I had with Jenny. She was unique and irreplaceable, which made the loneliness much harder to bear. After she died, going to school became torture. Every time I entered the building, I felt as if an enormous weight was crushing my chest. I hated being there. I hated that everything reminded me of the plans we had made together and that now would never come true. I stopped caring about my classes, I fell behind with my homework and I avoided contact with people as much as I could. I didn't have the energy to socialize and, to be honest, I didn't want to either. I became an empty version of myself, just existing, but not really living. That's when I started smoking and drinking. At first, I thought they were the solution. A way to escape the unbearable weight of my pain. When I was under the influence of alcohol or drugs, the pain of losing Jenny felt less intense and I could pretend that everything was fine. It was like taking a break from constantly missing her, from that suffocating emptiness that had taken control of my life. But at the time I didn't realize how quickly I was becoming dependent on these substances. Alcohol and vaping stopped being just a distraction. They became my way of coping with reality and I needed more and more of them to feel even remotely normal. By the time my parents realized what was happening, I was already too involved in these addictions. They tried to talk sense to me, but I refused to listen to them. I was so immersed in my pain that I convinced myself that I didn't need anyone's help. I lied to myself, telling myself that I was fine, even though I clearly wasn't. I ignored all their advice and continued to sink deeper and deeper into habits that were destroying me. At the time I couldn't see it, but I was in a downward spiral and I urgently needed professional help. The next 2 years were a confusing mix of bad decisions and selfish behavior, and I became a real nightmare for my family. I was out of control, staying out late into the night, not caring about their concerns or the trouble I might get into. I took my father's car without permission, often putting my life and the lives of others at risk by driving under the influence of alcohol. Looking back, it scares me to think of the risks I took and how reckless I was with my life. I was so focused on my own pain and chaos that I didn't think about anyone else. I even went so far as to steal money from my father's wallet, convincing myself that he wouldn't notice or that he wouldn't care even if he found out. In my mind, everything revolved around me, my pain, my escape, my way of numbing everything I didn't want to feel. I didn't stop to think about how my actions were destroying my family, or how it was affecting my younger sister Peggy. She deserved better. She deserved to have an older brother who was a role model, someone to look up to, but instead I was selfish and distant, too consumed with my own self-destruction to see the damage I was causing. To this day, I wish I had been a better son to my parents and a better older brother to Peggy. Everything came to a head one night when the police caught my friends and I drinking. As we were all underage, we were arrested immediately. We had to wait in a holding cell until our parents arrived. When my parents showed up in the middle of the night, I could see the exhaustion and frustration on their faces. The car ride home was terrible. My father was furious and yelled at me the whole way. His voice was full of anger and pain. My mother just kept repeating how disappointed she was in me. Hearing that from her hurt more than anything else. I didn't argue or defend myself. I knew they were right. I had been behaving like a complete loser and deserved their anger. I sat in silence, feeling the weight of their words and the reality of what I had become. It was one of the lowest points of my life, and for the first time, I couldn't ignore how far I had fallen. When we finally arrived home, my father turned to me and told me bluntly that he could no longer allow me to live in his house. He didn't even try to soften his words. He wanted me to leave them before I could ruin their lives any further. My mother agreed with him and quickly backed him up, saying that I was too toxic to be around and that they couldn't risk my behavior influencing my little sister Peggy. They didn't want her to become someone like me. Hearing those words felt like a punch in the stomach. Although I knew I had been out of control, hearing my own parents say they no longer wanted me around was devastating. It was clear that I had pushed them too far away and now I was facing the consequences of my actions. In the end, they decided to send me to live with my paternal grandparents who lived very far away. At that point, I hadn't had any close contact with them for years. When I was younger, I adored them. We had a very loving and close relationship, but as I grew older and fell into my spiral of self-destruction, I had lost touch with them. That's why I was surprised that my parents wanted me to go and live with them. I tried to reason with my parents, but they didn't change their minds. My father threatened me, saying that if I didn't want to live with my grandparents, then I would have to find my own place to live because they were fed up of looking after me. In the end, I had no choice but to go and live with my grandparents. Part of me wondered why they had agreed to take me and considering the mess I had become, but I was also grateful that they were giving me a place to live when my own parents didn't want me under their roof. I knew this would be my last chance to turn things around. At least now I had somewhere to go and maybe, just maybe, I could figure out how to rebuild my life. From the first moment, my paternal grandparents welcomed me with open arms into their home and their lives. My grandmother was especially understanding and affectionate. She told me that she and my grandfather knew that I had been going through very difficult times and assured me that they were there to help me heal and get back on track. She even advised me not to hold a grudge against my parents for having thrown me out, explaining that they were also suffering and probably didn't know how to handle the situation otherwise. My grandmother's words stuck in my mind. She was the first person, after Jenny, who really sat down with me, listened to what I had to say and made me feel like I mattered as a person, not just a problem to be solved. At first, I felt uncomfortable living with my grandparents. I wasn't used to their quiet lifestyle or the way they seemed to genuinely care for me without conditions or judgments, but as the weeks turned into months, I began to adjust. I started to see their home as a safe space and that discomfort I felt eventually disappeared. Over time, I started attending a local college during the day and in the evenings I would help my grandfather on his farm. Anyone who has worked on a farm knows that it is not an easy job. There were long hours of physical labor and I would often return home at the end of the day completely exhausted. This tiredness turned out to be a blessing in disguise for me. I was so exhausted at the end of each day that I didn't have the energy or even the desire to resort to alcohol or vaping. Little by little, my mind began to clear and I started to feel like a better version of myself. I even started going to therapy to face the deeper issues that I had been avoiding for so long. The sessions with my therapist were eye-opening. He helped me face the pain I had buried after losing Jenny and recognize the unhealthy ways I had tried to cope with it, such as alcohol and vaping. During this time, my parents have completely cut off all contact with me, saying they needed to distance themselves from me, and simply left me alone with my grandparents to sort out my life. Although it hurt a lot, I tried to respect their decision. It was then that my therapist suggested that I could perhaps use writing as a way of communicating with them, specifically by writing letters. The idea was to express what I was feeling, what I was working on and how I was trying to become a better person. It was a way of bridging the gap even if they weren't ready to talk to me directly. So that's what I did. Every week without fail, I wrote a letter to my parents. I put my whole heart into those letters, sharing my thoughts, progress and reflections. I told them about the therapy sessions, about working on the farm with Granddad, about university and how sorry I was for the pain I had caused them. I held out hope that one day they might pick up the phone, call my grandparents or even write back to me, but they never did. For almost 4 years, I faithfully sent those letters, hoping each time that this might be the one that would make a difference. Even so, there was no reply. Only silence. From time to time, I would receive news about my family through my cousins. They would tell me that my parents were well, that Peggy was excelling at school and making them proud. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy when I heard these things. I wanted to be part of that life again, to feel that I belonged to my own family, but it was clear that they no longer wanted me there. So little by little, I learned to let them go and stopped sending them letters after that. Over the years, I continued with my life working on myself. After graduating from university, I got a job as a telemarketer. Surprisingly, this role turned out to be perfect for me. I have always been very sociable, and I discovered that I have a natural talent for persuasion. Over the years, my ability to connect with people and my persistence paid off. I have been steadily promoted within the company, first being promoted to team leader and eventually reaching my current position as sales manager. One of the advantages of my job is its flexibility. As most of my responsibilities can be managed with just a laptop, internet connection and a webcam, I have been able to continue living with my grandparents. This arrangement has allowed me to save a significant part of my income while being there for my grandparents. They took care of me for years when I needed it most, and now I try to return the favor in any way I can. I take care of buying groceries, paying utility bills and helping Grandpa with the farm animals whenever I'm not working. 2 months ago, something incredible happened. Grandpa helped me get a small piece of land that was being auctioned at a very affordable price. I invested all my savings in buying it, and I can honestly say it was the best decision I ever made. I chose to invest in this land because I didn't want to move away from my grandparents or this community. This place has become my refuge. It is where I have found a true sense of belonging, where I have finally made friends with whom I enjoy spending time, and where I have built meaningful connections with neighbors who treat me as if I were part of their family. Most importantly, this place does not bring back memories of my past with alcohol. Over the last few weeks, I have been slowly working on building a house on my land while holding down my full-time job. And to be honest, it has been a hectic and stressful time. Yesterday, completely out of the blue, I found out that my parents had finally got in touch with my grandparents wanting to talk to me after almost a decade of silence. At the time of their call, I had gone out to do the shopping. When I returned home, my grandmother gently sat me down and told me that my parents had called. It was the last thing I expected to hear. Apparently, my parents had told my grandparents that they missed me after all these years and wanted me to call them as soon as possible. My first reaction was one of pure confusion. After almost 10 years of not hearing from them, no replies to my letters, no acknowledgement of my efforts, no attempt at reconciliation. And now, suddenly, they wanted to talk. It didn't make any sense. I could see the same surprise reflected in my grandparents' expressions. They were as baffled as I was. Then my grandfather, who always prefers to be direct, told me that if I wanted, I could simply ignore them in the same way that they had ignored me for all these years. He had witnessed how hard I had worked to rebuild my life. I didn't want them to hurt me again. My grandmother assured me that the decision was entirely mine. She told me that whatever I chose to do, whether to get in touch with them or not, she and my grandfather would support me and stand by me. At the moment, I find myself overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. I can't tell if I should feel happy or anxious. I'm not sure what steps to take next. Would I be the bad guy if I decided not to respond to them, considering that they practically forgot about me all these years? Update 1. First of all, I want to thank everyone for showing so much understanding and kindness regarding my past problems. Now that I look back, I realize that my parents should have taken me to a grief specialist after losing my best friend, instead of acting as if nothing had happened. Perhaps if they had made that decision, I would never have sought refuge in alcohol and vaping. However, I can't put all the blame on them either. I let them down enormously. Although I do wish they had found it in their hearts to forgive me, especially considering that I was just a teenager at the time. To clear up some doubts that keep coming up, I changed my phone number several times over the years, so my parents couldn't contact me directly and had to communicate through my grandparents. I think this was for the best, as I'm not sure how I would have reacted if they had called me without intermediaries. After several years of writing them letters without receiving a reply, I decided to stop sending them. To this day I don't know if they ever read them or simply threw them away. It is important to mention that my parents never sent money to my grandparents during the whole time I lived with them. They simply stopped caring about me once I left their house. Luckily, my grandparents took me in and looked after me, and that is why I owe them my life. As for Peggy and I, there is no longer any kind of relationship between us. After I moved out, I focused completely on improving as a person while my parents made sure to keep Peggy as far away from me as possible. As some have pointed out in the comments, I owe it to my parents to at least listen to what they have to say before simply ignoring them. So that's what I'm going to do. Update 2. A month has passed since my last update. I hadn't been able to update before because a lot has been happening. It turns out that my parents had an ulterior motive for contacting me. We met via video call, which started off quite positively. My parents expressed their satisfaction with all the progress I had made over the years and how happy they were to hear from my relatives and grandparents how I had completely transformed my life. It felt good to hear those words after so many years of silence and rejection. For a brief moment, I felt like they finally saw the person I had become. Then they spent about 20 minutes talking non-stop about my sister and all her achievements. They went on and on, expressing how proud they were of her, how well she was doing in life, how she excelled in everything she did. Of course I was happy for Peggy. She deserved all that praise and I never wanted to take it away from her. But at that moment, it felt like they were rubbing my face in it. I mean, it was our first conversation in a long time. After all that, my father finally revealed the real reason why they had contacted me after so many years. He explained that they had heard from our relatives that I had bought some land and had made significant financial progress, something that he never expected of me. He even joked that he always thought Peggy would be the successful one. But it turned out that I was the one who had exceeded all his expectations. His indirect compliment took me by surprise, but I just laughed nervously to ease the tension, as I didn't know where the conversation was going. He went on to say that he and Mom needed to ask me for a favor. When I asked what it was, my father hesitated for a moment before revealing that my mother had recently been diagnosed with breast cancer. I was speechless as he went on to explain that they hadn't told anyone yet, as it had only been a month. My mother had started chemotherapy, but she also needed surgery, and the costs were adding up fast. My father explained to me that over the years he had used most of his money to help Peggy through college and had even bought her an apartment. So now, with Mom's unexpected medical emergency, they simply did not have enough resources to cover her treatment. So when they heard about my land purchase through our relatives, they decided to contact me in the hope that I could help them. My mother acknowledged that she understood how all this might sound to me, how strange or uncomfortable it might be to help them financially, considering everything that had happened between us. She admitted the years of silence, but said that now they were desperate. The medical bills kept mounting and they simply didn't have the resources to cover them. They had no one else to turn to except me. He suggested that maybe I could move back in with them, and in this way we could finally start to rebuild our relationship and make things right. At that moment, I was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, hearing that my mother was battling cancer devastated me. Of course I wanted to help her. She was my mother, but on the other hand, I couldn't just drop everything and go back home to them. My whole life was established here now. Nor could I ignore the frustration and resentment I still felt about all the years they kept me apart. I couldn't help wondering why they were asking for my help when they could turn to their beloved daughter. I asked them if Peggy knew about Mom's cancer and they confirmed that she did, but that they felt she was too young to help them and that she shouldn't have to pay their medical bills. According to them, my sister didn't have a job as good as mine either, so I was the only one who could really help them in their time of need. I explained to them honestly that if they had contacted me before I bought my land, I would have had the financial means to help them without any problem. But after this investment, I had no savings left. I had invested everything in my future and was working hard to recover my savings while building my house. I had no extra money to send them. My father then interrupted me, suggesting that I could start by sending them at least a few $100s of my salary each month. As for the rest of the money, he urged me to talk to my grandparents to see if they could pitch in. If that still wasn't enough, he suggested that I could organize an online fundraising campaign to raise money for Mom's treatment and help them in any way I could. I was surprised at how naturally they expected me to take on the role of their financial savior after so long. I mean, this was our first conversation in almost a decade and they were already asking me for money, expecting me to solve their financial problems without even acknowledging the emotional weight of everything that had happened between us. I told them that if they really needed a few $100s, maybe I could send them something. But I couldn't guarantee it. I had my own financial difficulties to face and I couldn't stretch any further. I also made it very clear that I would never ask my grandparents to lend them money. They had already done too much for me over the years and they had enough responsibilities as it was. My grandparents didn't deserve to be involved in this situation again. When I said that, I could see how my parents' expressions changed instantly. They didn't like what I said at all. My mother's face tightened and she started accusing me of being insensitive. She said they would never have contacted me if they hadn't been desperate. But now, she was disappointed to see that I was still the same selfish, immature boy who only thought about himself. It reminded me of how I had almost ruined their lives with my bad decisions years ago. I replied to my mother that although I acknowledged my past bad behavior, it wasn't as if I hadn't paid for it. I mean, they had literally sent me away to live with my grandparents and cut off all contact with me. Not once had they contacted them to find out how I was or even to acknowledge what had happened. And now, when they finally contacted me, it was all about what they needed from me. How could they dare to call me selfish when they had never considered my feelings or difficulties? My father, visibly frustrated, said they couldn't change the past. But now that they knew I was doing well in life, That was precisely why they were contacting me. He mentioned the sacrifices he and Mom had made to raise me and how, after all they had done for me, he felt the least he could do was send money for my mother's treatment. He even went so far as to suggest that I seriously consider selling my land, the land I had worked so hard to buy, and give them the full amount. He assured me that if I did that, they would never ask me for money again in the future. At that moment, I was completely consumed by anger. I felt my chest tighten with rage and I firmly told them that I didn't owe them anything. I had already apologized countless times in all the letters I had written to them over the years, but it was clear that they hadn't even bothered to read them. I made it clear to them that whatever I had become, whatever progress I had made, was thanks to my own efforts and the support of my grandparents, who never abandoned me no matter how terrible my behavior had been. I told my parents that if there was anyone I would be willing to sacrifice myself for, it would be them, my grandparents, who had helped me become a better person and had been there for me when my own parents turned their backs on me. They were the ones who gave me a second chance in life, not my parents. My mother tried to argue, but I told her I no longer cared what she and Dad thought of me. I was done with this conversation, done trying to make them understand. I had spent too much time and energy trying to win their approval and it had only led to more disappointment and pain. They had made their decisions over the years and now I was making mine. Enough was enough. They needed to find another way to help themselves or ask their youngest daughter to help because I wouldn't do anything for them. Since that heated argument, my father has not stopped sending me messages trying to make me feel guilty and responsible. He told me that my mother has been crying for days because of what I said and how hurt she is by my words. He says that if anything happens to her, it will all be my fault. Part of me feels guilty. After all, she is my mother and no one likes to hear that their mother is sick, no matter how complicated their relationship is. But at the same time, I can't let them manipulate me into giving them money when I really don't have any. I am completely exhausted by this whole situation. Update 3. It's been 4 months since my last update. I just wanted to let you know that I am still firm in my decision not to help my parents financially, and my grandparents haven't either. My parents eventually told my grandparents about my mother's cancer and asked them for money. Fortunately, my grandfather rejected them immediately and refused to send them money. Without hesitation, my grandfather told my father that he needed to take charge and take care of Mom, as it was not our responsibility to do so. My grandmother only offered to travel herself to take care of my mother if she ever needed it. But beyond that, they couldn't offer anything else. When my parents heard this, they were furious. But honestly, there wasn't much they could do about it. After all, my grandparents have no obligation to help them, especially after everything that has happened between us. I guess my parents are finally facing the consequences of their own actions. Also, for all those who are asking, Peggy has not contacted me at all. I'm not sure if my parents told her about our conversation or if she simply doesn't know, but it's clear that my sister doesn't want to have any kind of relationship with me, so I will respect her decision and not interfere in her life.